Dawn, 10th of June, 1944, near St. Lo. Night's damp still clung to the hedgerows, and the air smelled of cordite and wet stone. In the washed-out gray, a German artillery crew studied the gap where a rail bridge had stood until their charges tore it down 48 hours earlier. They had watched the span fold on itself, girders shrieking, ballast geysering into the Weir Valley. No locomotive, they believed, would ever cross here again. Then a whistle threaded the mist, thin, disbelieving. Out of drifting dust came a U.S. Army train, a low, purposeful locomotive hissing steam, flat cars clanking behind it under the 30-ton weight of M4 Shermans, engineers in denim jackets waving from a track that had not existed at sunrise the day before. For a heartbeat, the gunners did not fire. One would later write that the sight felt like sorcery, iron grown from the earth. Orders snapped. Shells walked the embankment while the train crawled with the slow courage of a siege tower. Yet the line held. Fresh creosote stung the nose as pale new timbers flashed in the light, fish plates bright bolted, trestle legs cribbed tight and sandbagged, ballast tamped clean. Field phones crackled rearward. A bridge destroyed on 8th of June now carried traffic the morning of the 10th. Patrols added that culverts and sidings along the Saint-Lô-Coutances run had reappeared overnight. Higher headquarters asked the same question the gun crews could not answer under the smoke. Who rebuilt a railway under fire? Reports named an American railway service, special battalions of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that seemed to make track move as fast as armor. To understand how those miracles were prepared, we have to step back, months before D-Day, into the plans that turned rails into a weapon. By 1942, war had become a contest of tonnage and timetables. Every army knew that victory moved not on legs or wheels, but on rails. In the smoking ruins of Kharkov and Kiev, German supply officers had learned that panzer spearheads could advance only as far as their trains could follow. The Wehrmacht had inherited Europe's most extensive rail network, 6,000 kilometers of French and Belgian main lines already built to continental gauge, and tens of thousands of captured Soviet wagons and locomotives. Yet even with those advantages, fuel, ammunition, and rations arrived days late to the front. For the Allies, the problem was worse. Any invasion of Western Europe meant landing on a coastline whose railways would be obliterated by the very bombing that made the landings possible. To strike Germany, they would first have to rebuild France. Inside the combined chiefs of staff in London, planners faced a paradox. Before D-Day, Allied bombers had to paralyze German logistics, bridges, marshalling yards, and repair depots. But the moment troops were ashore, those same arteries had to be pumping again. The solution emerged in what was codenamed Transportation Plan C. Conceived jointly by Air Marshal Tedder and General Eisenhower's staff, it decreed a brutal sequencing: destroy the network now, then resurrect it faster than the enemy could respond. To do that, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps organized a new breed of unit, the Railway Operating Battalions and the Railway Shop Battalions. Each battalion functioned as a miniature. Railroad company, 800 men equipped with cranes, pile drivers, mobile forges, prefabricated trestles, and even their own locomotives shipped in sections. Behind them stood the expertise of civilian giants, the Pennsylvania Railroad, Union Pacific, and Southern Pacific, whose engineers traded business suits for khaki and whose manuals became field doctrine. Allied staff estimated that reopening a single corridor from Cherbourg to Paris would take 6 weeks of uninterrupted work. Yet hidden in the margins of those estimates was a daring wager that with speed, discipline, and improvisation, engineers could rebuild a railway while the guns were still firing. That wager would be tested on the beaches of Normandy, where the war's true arteries, steel rails and wooden ties, waited to be reborn under fire. When the U.S. Army Transportation Corps began disembarking in Britain in late 1943, they looked less like soldiers and more like an industrial convoy. Crated locomotives, rail-mounted cranes, and entire workshops rolled down the gangways of Liberty ships. Among their most precious cargo was 1,500 miles of prefabricated panel track, each 39-foot section of steel rail already bolted to pressed steel ties. 8 men could drop one in under 2 minutes, creating an instant line ready for light traffic. The system, developed from American branch line construction, turned railroad building into a modular assembly operation. Behind every combat division preparing for D-Day stood these quiet craftsmen, trained not to destroy, but to restore. Alongside the Americans, British Royal Engineers brought their own miracle of modularity, the Bailey Bridge. Designed by Sir Donald Bailey, it was a lattice of prefabricated steel panels that could be carried by truck, assembled by hand, and launched across a 200-foot span in less than half a day. Where the Germans relied on heavy fixed spans, the Allies built flexibility into every component. If a viaduct vanished under bombing, a Bailey could replace it before the smoke had cleared. Soon, warehouses across southern England filled with piles of prefabricated rails, bridge sections, and replacement locomotives, each labeled for a specific French port not yet captured. The logistics were staggering. A single railway operating company could move up to 12,000 tons of ammunition, rations, and fuel per day, 10 times what a truck convoy could haul over comparable terrain. To sustain that tempo under fire, engineers designed mobile repair trains, self-contained steel workshops fitted with acetylene torches, generators, spare couplers, and radio vans linked directly to chef headquarters. Their timetables matched infantry advances measured not in days but in miles per hour. This was railroading transformed into combat, the fusion of civil engineering precision with battlefield urgency. Yet in late 1943, few commanders believed that any of it would work once German artillery found the range. Within months, those doubts would meet their reckoning on the shattered rails of Normandy. When the guns of Normandy finally fell silent on the beaches, the real race began inland. The port of Cherbourg, captured on June 27, 1944, was supposed to be the Allies' lifeline, its deep-water docks feeding the vast armies pushing toward Paris. Instead, what engineers found was a moonscape. German demolition teams had done their work with methodical precision. Every rail line radiating from the harbor was cratered, every bridge mined, every locomotive destroyed where it stood. More than 100 to 200 explosions had carved pits through the embankments. 30 bridges lay in twisted heaps. For the U.S. 729th Railway Operating Battalion, arriving within 48 hours, it was not a port but a wound to be stitched under fire. The battalion's bulldozers rumbled through streets still littered with mines and unexploded shells. Using the panel track shipped from Britain months earlier, they began laying temporary rails directly over bomb debris. The first goal was modest, just a 10-mile stretch to Valognes. But even that required rebuilding 3 small bridges and clearing wreckage from tunnels still smoldering from demolition charges. Yet by July 5th, barely 8 days after Cherbourg's capture, the first spur reopened. A U.S. Army locomotive, its boiler patched with field-welded steel, hauled, flat cars stacked with fuel drums inland, while artillery echoed from the front. German. Prisoners assigned to clear rubble stopped to stare. They had watched these same rails blasted apart a week earlier and could not fathom their return. Within 3 weeks, the system was running at wartime tempo. 4 Allied divisions were receiving supplies entirely by rail, reducing truck convoys by nearly 40% and freeing thousands of vehicles for frontline use. Eisenhower himself called it a logistical victory as vital as Omaha. German intelligence, intercepting chatter about operating railways in Normandy, dismissed it as deception, until reconnaissance confirmed the impossible. Steam plumes curling above working trains under active shellfire. That revelation forced a painful realization within the Wehrmacht that the Americans' advance could no longer be measured by divisions or tanks, but by miles of resurrected rail. By late July 1944, confusion was spreading through the Wehrmacht's intelligence network almost as fast as the Allied trains themselves. Reports arriving at the Feldnachrichtenstellen, the German field intelligence posts, spoke of staggering tonnage moving inland from Normandy. Hundreds of rail cars per day hauling fuel, ammunition, and armor from ports the Germans believed impassable. At OKW headquarters in Rastenburg, General Alfred Jodel's operations staff scoffed. Their maps still showed every bridge between Carentan and St. Lo marked with the black cross of demolition. Impossible. one colonel noted in the margin of an intercepted dispatch. "No line south of Valognes can be operating." But disbelief began to crumble under the lens of reconnaissance cameras. Luftwaffe pilots returning from sorties over the Cotentin Peninsula brought back images of trains, real trains, snaking through the smoke of battlefield fires, their locomotives flanked by flak wagons bristling with Beaufort's guns. The mystery deepened when a captured U.S. engineer near Avranches, interrogated by the 84th Army Corps, confirmed the Allies were using prefabricated rails and mobile repair trains. German analysts, astonished, gave them a nickname, Eisenbahngeister, the railway ghosts. Reports described how entire stretches of line destroyed one evening seemed to reappear by dawn, complete with telegraph wires and ballast freshly tamped. Panzer officers, stranded with fuel trains immobilized on the German side, vented fury in their diaries. One Oberleutnant of the 2nd Panzer Division wrote bitterly, "We are dying for lack of rail, while the Americans conjure new ones from smoke." The most unnerving claim came from the front near Pontaubault, where scouts swore Allied engineers rebuilt a bridge under direct artillery observation in less than 48 hours, working only at night beneath swinging searchlights and mortar fire. Such stories, once dismissed as exaggeration, began shaping operational fears. If demolition no longer delayed pursuit, retreat itself lost meaning. By the time this realization reached Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, Rommel's successor, his orders to destroy bridges south of St. Lo carried an air of futility. Even as charges detonated, Allied crews were already surveying replacements. What began as disbelief had turned to dread. Germany's mastery of movement, once its proudest strength, was collapsing under an enemy who could rebuild faster than it could destroy. Behind every rebuilt bridge and gleaming rail in Normandy stood an industrial rhythm that never slept. In 1943 and 1944, American rail companies, Baldwin, Bethlehem Steel, and Carnegie, Illinois among them, produced over 20,000 prefabricated track panels each month, each precisely machined to fit the standard 39-foot section used by the Transportation Corps. Canadian foundries from Hamilton to Sault Ste. Marie poured Bailey Bridge components day and night, shipping tons of prefabricated steel to Britain in convoys escorted through U-boat-infested waters. The result was an immense reserve of modular infrastructure, waiting only for the engineers to bring it to life under fire. In the sprawling depots of Southampton and Bristol, locomotives stood lined like sleeping giants, British WD-2-80s and American-built S-160s, each sealed in waterproof cradles and coated with rust inhibitor for beach unloading. These 160,000-pound engines had been shipped in sections, assembled on site by crews who could rejoin a boiler and chassis in less than a day. Around them rose warehouses stacked with rail spikes, tie plates, and bridge trusses, all cataloged and cross-referenced for instant deployment. The U.S. Army's Engineer Special Brigades orchestrated this ballet of steel, syncing every Liberty ship's manifest with inland distribution timetables. One such vessel, the SS Henry Whitney, arrived off the English coast, carrying enough rail to rebuild 20 miles of line, and was completely unloaded within 18 hours of docking, every crate accounted for and reloaded onto waiting trucks. Even perishable supply chains depended on these rebuilt arteries. Quartermaster reefer trains, refrigerated cars packed with meat, dairy, and medical supplies, relied on those same rails to sustain entire armies advancing across the Bocage. Where Germany's once mighty rail system had been reduced to patchwork repairs staffed by exhausted laborers, the Allies transformed industrial abundance into battlefield momentum. Yet the miracle came at human cost, men working knee-deep in mud, under strafing fire, rebuilding the same bridges twice in a week. Their labor turned raw industry into motion, and soon that motion would roar eastward in the breakout across France. After the breakout from St. Lo in late July 1944, the Allied advance through France became a moving tide of steel, smoke, and speed. and the men of the U.S. Army railway battalions were its unseen current. Patton's Third Army surged eastward in a whirlwind of dust and diesel, and scarcely 40 miles behind its armored columns came the 708th Railway Grand Division, laying down the means to feed the momentum. Their task was relentless: rebuild as fast as the front advanced. Near Le Mans, the engineers worked amid craters and twisted girders, their hammers echoing through the night. Within 36 hours, Bailey Bridge spans stretched across a 200-foot gap blasted by retreating Germans, allowing armored trains to rumble forward carrying the lifeblood of war, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. By early September, the restored lines snaked past Chartres toward Paris itself. On August 28th, just 4 days after liberation, the great Gare Saint-Lazare reopened. Its platforms, blackened by explosions, now bore American diesel shunters instead of Wehrmacht supply cars. French civilians stood on the overpasses to watch the first Allied train glide in, its whistle cutting through a city still filled with smoke and celebration. Every spike driven and plate bolted was a declaration that occupation was ending, not just politically but physically, as the railways of France came alive again. The work was perilous. German rearguards left timed charges that detonated beneath passing locomotives, and snipers harassed repair teams along exposed embankments. Yet the engineers advanced with a grim persistence that seemed mechanical in its certainty. To the retreating enemy, the sound of distant whistles became a haunting omen. Reports from the Ardennes described trains running where no track had existed a week before, as if the Allies were conjuring rails from the rubble. The pursuit was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in rebuilt lines, each one carrying the inevitability of defeat straight into Belgium. For the weary German infantry retreating toward the Meuse in September 1944, the war's most terrifying sound was no longer the shriek of incoming shells. It was the distant, rhythmic call of a train whistle cutting through the morning fog. It meant the enemy's supply lines had caught them again. Diaries recovered from the 276th Infantry Division spoke of feeling hunted by rails, an eerie sense that Allied locomotives were advancing faster than German troops could withdraw. Soldiers swore that bridges they had personally demolished were somehow carrying traffic days later, and that fresh track gleamed where rubble had lain. The disbelief turned to dread. If destruction could not stop pursuit, then retreat itself was meaningless. Across the lines, that same sound filled the engineers with defiant pride. Many were railroad men in uniform, switchmen from Illinois, bridge crews from Yorkshire, welders from Ohio, whose civilian trade had become an act of war. They laid track through shellfire and fog, sometimes singing over the hammer blows that echoed through liberated valleys. Letters home carried the same refrain: "We lay it faster than Jerry can wreck it." The rhythm of rebuilding became its own source of morale, a daily proof that the Allies could not only conquer ground but resurrect it. Commanders soon noticed the effect. Divisions supplied by rail moved with confidence, their soldiers sleeping with full bellies and fuel lines guaranteed. The U.S. Army's Information and Education Division began studying what it called the logistical morale link, finding that nothing steadied a fighting man's nerves like the visible sign of movement behind him. Rolling trains, lights on in the depots, the smell of coal smoke drifting east. Each whistle through a liberated town became both a tactical advantage and a symbol. The war's outcome was now as inevitable as the next train arriving on time. But that sense of invincibility would soon meet its harshest trial in the frozen months ahead. By the autumn of 1944, the Allies had achieved what German logisticians once considered impossible, a seamless rhythm of movement that transformed railways into a weapon. From the beaches of Normandy to the Siegfried Line, more than 30,000 tons of supplies moved each day by rail, flowing in a constant pulse of steel and steam. Fuel, ammunition, rations, and replacement tanks rolled eastward with machine-like precision. Patton's armored divisions, once chained to truck convoys, vulnerable to weather and fuel shortages, now advanced without pause. Ammunition dumps that would have taken days to resupply arrived by the trainload overnight. What began as engineering improvisation had matured into a new form of operational art, railway warfare. For the German High Command, still reeling from the catastrophe of Falaise, this development defied logic. Their doctrine assumed that the destruction of infrastructure would delay any major advance by weeks. Yet by October, Allied engineers had proven otherwise. The rebuilt French network allowed simultaneous thrusts toward Antwerp, Metz, and the German frontier, compressing the timetable for any organized counteroffensive. Wehrmacht staff reports described an enemy that moves as if on rails, a statement both literal and metaphorical. Even during the Ardennes offensive in December, when snow and chaos shattered supply chains, the Allies' railway units rerouted entire supply corridors within 48 hours, restoring the flow of fuel critical to halting the German advance at Bastogne. After the war, military analysts would conclude that this rail capacity shortened the Battle of the Bulge by at least 2 weeks and prevented a deeper German penetration into Belgium. Strategically, it marked the death of an old assumption that destruction could deny movement. The Allies had made repair faster than ruin, logistics stronger than sabotage. But as the front rolled toward the Rhine, a new challenge emerged. The longer the line of victory stretched, the more fragile its arteries became under the strain of winter and distance. By the first months of 1945, as Allied columns crossed into Germany, the miracle of movement that had carried them from Normandy began to strain against the limits of nature and physics. The rails that had conquered France now faced the Rhineland's winter, snow that froze ballast solid, sleet that welded switches shut, and rivers swollen beyond bridging. The Germans, retreating across their homeland, turned every junction into a trap. Mines were hidden beneath signal boxes, booby-trapped locomotives left hissing with timed charges. Bridges spanning the Rhine, vast lattice giants of iron, were too wide even for Bailey spans to replace. The very system that had made the Allied advance unstoppable was now fighting the elements themselves. The U.S. First Military Railway Service answered with sheer invention. When embankments washed away, engineers packed the ground with ice and timber, laying twin temporary tracks across frozen causeways. Amphibious DUKW trucks were stripped of cargo beds and refitted with rollers to ferry rails across rivers. In March 1945, during the dash for the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, rail battalions rebuilt the approach lines in 48 hours flat, 2 days faster than SHAEF planners thought possible. Supply trains clattered over the Rhine while smoke from the bridge's failed demolition still drifted across the water. Yet victory carried exhaustion in its wake. Men worked 20-hour shifts in sleet, collapsing beside fires under the shells of shattered stations. Locomotives froze solid in the yards. Crews thawed them by igniting oil drums beneath their boilers, a crude but life-saving improvisation. Still, the rhythm never stopped. Each glowing ember, each hammer strike was another mile pushed east. The railway war had reached its limit and its transformation. What began as battlefield logistics was becoming something larger, the first pulse of reconstruction for a continent emerging from ruin. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the men who had laid rail under fire became the first architects of Europe's recovery. The U.S. Army's railway battalions, whose hammers had rung across Normandy and the Ardennes, now turned from war-making to rebuilding. Their wartime ingenuity, prefabricated panel track, modular Bailey bridges, mobile repair trains, became the scaffolding of peace. Across France, Belgium, and the wrecked Ruhr Valley, these same methods reawakened the lifelines of a continent. Sidings once used for ammunition now carried coal and food. In the shattered marshalling yards of Cologne and Liège, American engineers worked beside former enemies, their uniforms dusted with the same gray ash of burned-out cities. Many of the railway units were absorbed into the U.S. Army of Occupation, reorganized as reconstruction detachments alongside civilian engineers. What they accomplished in combat zones translated directly into peacetime efficiency. Lines that planners had predicted would take a decade to restore reached pre-war capacity by 1947. France's main trunk routes, the Paris-Le Mans, the Calais-Lille, were fully operational thanks to methods born on the beaches of Normandy: modularity, coordination, and relentless tempo. The very principles that had moved divisions across battlefields now moved nations toward recovery. Their legacy extended far beyond track and ballast. The same logistical discipline that rebuilt Europe inspired the Marshall Plan, an economic campaign run with the precision of a railway timetable. Shipments, production quotas, and reconstruction projects were all modeled on the wartime supply network that had proven coordination could defeat chaos. For Germany, it was a transformation of purpose. The industrial genius once turned toward conquest now served rebuilding. The shock of Allied trains running under fire became, within years, admiration for their order and cooperation. To understand how that metamorphosis began, one must return to where disbelief first gave way to awe: the shattered bridge at St. Lo and the impossible whistle that rose through the fog. At St. Lo today, wildflowers and tall grass sway where the rails once shone silver in the sun. The air is quiet, broken only by the wind whispering through the hedgerows. Yet beneath the soil lies the ghost of steel, the bridge that should have been gone forever. In June 1944, under shellfire and smoke, that bridge was rebuilt in 48 hours by men who refused to wait for the war to end before creating something new. Its resurrection changed not only the course of a single battle, but the very meaning of warfare. It proved that engineering, organization, endurance, and the will to rebuild could strike with as much force as any artillery barrage. For the German gunners who first glimpsed that impossible train emerging from the mist, disbelief turned to dread. They saw not just an enemy advancing, but an idea that destruction itself could be outpaced. The Americans' true power, they realized, was not merely in tanks or bombers, but in a kind of defiance that turned ruins into roads and wreckage into railways. Each rebuilt line became a declaration that the war's momentum had shifted irreversibly. The story of those 2 days at St. Lo captures the essence of total war: the fusion of machine and man, of technology and will. When that first whistle cut through the haze of battle, it signaled more than a train's arrival. It heralded the return of movement, of supply, of hope. The rails are gone now, swallowed by grass and time, but their echo endures, a faint hum beneath the earth, reminding us that civilization too was rebuilt one track at a time.